In the middle of 2021, we got a glimpse into what kind of experience the sequel to Breath of the Wild is going to be, and it looks astounding to say the least. With seemingly the same emphasis on exploration and freedom, but now being set in the sky with floating islands and new abilities for Link to utilize in conquering these new locations. In an interview with Kotaku, series director Eiji Onuma commented on the fact that the sequel originated from the breadth of ideas the team had for additional DLC for the first game. Initially, we were thinking of just DLC ideas, but then we had a lot of ideas and we said, this is too many ideas, let's just make one new game and start from scratch. This makes sense, as Breath of the Wild is essentially a new blank canvas for the Zelda series. Even though the sequel seems to be packed with new concepts, there's still lots that we don't know, and probably won't know for a long time. But some things are worth discussing, and I want to use the canvas of the original game to see how the sequel could improve on some of its staple mechanics. So, let's talk about game designs for Breath of the Wild 2. The first point I want to talk about is one of the most controversial points of design in Breath of the Wild, namely weapon durability. This is a point of contention to say the least, but it certainly gave Breath of the Wild an identity and a unique point of difficulty. It provided the player with a reason to be resourceful with their weapons and when they used them. This meant that traditionally weaker enemies posed more of a threat, as the player was often inclined to use their more expendable weapons against common threats and save more powerful weapons for times where they might need them. It also forces the player to think on the fly when things unexpectedly break, in the middle of a tense battle, forcing them to utilize their surroundings or to get creative with what little they have, be it desperately seeking a makeshift weapon or using the runes in their Sheikah tablet. Breath of the Wild is at its best when it forces you to get creative. But I think there are most certainly things that could have been improved upon. In a nutshell, there are three core areas regarding Breath of the Wild's weapons: the durability, your inventory space, and the availability of other powerful weapons. You break a weapon, opening up some space in your inventory, and find some new weapons as you explore, creating a cycle where you use, break, and discover new weapon varieties, which gradually scales up in power as you explore the game. The primary issue comes from the weapon durability and the drop rate. In theory, having a limited amount of durability should make something feel more valuable and cause you to think about its practical use. But because of how easy it is to find powerful weapons around the mid-game, it feels like more of a chore and a common annoyance after the interesting moments of creativity during the first stretch of the game. Weapons will quickly break and then be subsequently replaced as you find a fair abundance of strong weapons as you continue to explore and fight powerful enemies. This isn't exactly a problem for the early part of Breath of the Wild, but in the mid to late game, the cycle starts to get a bit tedious. You've done this dance many times, and the durability mechanic brings about numerous aggravating interruptions to the smooth flow of gameplay. You should instead be feeling shocked, being suddenly forced to get creative or make a quick decision, which doesn't happen too often later on in the game. Around the mid to late point of the game, there's this counterintuitive feeling of hesitancy when using your strong weapons, which can bring about an avoidance of enemies altogether. Enemies eventually become large health sponges, which will wear down your weapons rather quickly, and will often lack a good incentive for you to fight them. Unless you're seeking to make a specific recipe that requires certain monster ingredients, which isn't too often, the majority of enemies just aren't worth your time. And in an open world game that encourages exploration, adventure, and curiosity, this is a bit of a problem. This issue is also highlighted by the value of rewards. A lot of quests reward Link with a new weapon, and since all of these break extremely quickly, the durability mechanic inherently cheapens the value of this loot you worked hard for. The last feeling you should experience when being rewarded is a feeling of disappointment and reluctance, where you want to do everything except swing this shiny new weapon. I do think resource management, and by extension, limited durability, is a good mechanic conceptually, and to improve it, we should look at a reference that implements a similar mechanic well, specifically the Resident Evil games. In these games, you don't quite have enough ammo to take out all the enemies, bringing a sense of value to every bullet in your inventory. Every time you find more ammo, you get a slight feeling of relief and empowerment. These games both have similar approaches to resource management conceptually, but Resident Evil does a much better job for a few reasons. First, this kind of mechanic works better in Resident Evil because the resources are directly affected by the player's skill. You can perfectly balance your ammo in conjunction with your melee attack, which obviously doesn't consume resources, and it's possible to have more than enough bullets in your inventory if you play resourcefully and skillfully. In Breath of the Wild, even if you're as efficient as possible with how you use your weapons, they're still going to break no matter what, and essentially at the same rate. Because there's no level of player input, if there was a way for players to repair their weapons by using resources, or to heavily reduce the rate at which they break thanks to their skill in combat, this mechanic would become fairer and far less frustrating. Secondly, in Resident Evil, the game offers just enough ammo to progress without losing tension. Resource management never overstays its welcome to the point where it becomes tedious. It really interrupts the flow of gameplay, as the fear of running out of ammo is more prominent than actually exhausting your supply, and that desire to avoid that scenario leads to smarter play. So, if Breath of the Wild's sequel was to increase weapon durability, and by consequence decrease the drop rate of weapons, this durability mechanic would become a little less frustrating and more exciting when weapons do break. And with the previous point about player input affecting durability, this system would become miles more fun, with the moments where your weapons suddenly break becoming more surprising and impactful, as they would be directly influenced by your skill. If you had a sword you particularly liked and cared about, there could be ways to fix it, say collecting rare resources to repair it, as well as a means to reduce the rate at which it breaks. This is a much better feeling than an expectation that it's going to break extremely quickly, de-incentivizing you from using it altogether, which isn't particularly fun when the first thing you want to do when picking up a brand new shiny sword is to go out and give it a swing. Another area of design that should have a bit of a revamp are the main dungeons. For Breath of the Wild, these are the 4 divine beasts. While these dungeons present some great ideas and a new take on dungeons, they struggle to stand apart and on their own merits. In previous Zelda games, dungeons were one of the series' high points, thanks to their complex, interconnected puzzles, their haunting, captivating music, their iconic treasure items, and most importantly, their theming. Theming, being the core influence for the aesthetics and mechanical design, allowed these dungeons to be rich with their own identity. These dungeons had a key foundation that they were built upon, which tied everything together. For example, in Twilight Princess, the Lakebed Temple had a central theme of water and changing the water flow, while also featuring a vast amount of water-themed enemies, like avoiding the swarms of piranhas or figuring out the bubble chew worms. This, alongside beautiful visual and audible themes, helped make the temple memorable and iconic. Every new dungeon you came across in a Zelda game was something entirely new and stood on its own, as theming was something the team behind the series figured out early on. Each dungeon had a core idea, and almost everything in the dungeon had some kind of relationship with that idea. The Divine Beasts, while having their strengths, lack the same vibrant flair and identity when compared to previous dungeons in the series, because they all somewhat blend together. But thanks to the Sheikah architecture and the independent puzzles, these dungeons felt like a cluster of Sheikah shrines cobbled together, opposed to a distinctive dungeon. They don't stand out from one another very well and are all similar mechanically. There are brief moments of thematic identity, like when using Varuda's water flow, or exploring the dark in Varadania. But these are few and far between. All in all, I think the Divine Beasts are a good attempt, but a format that leaves a large amount to be desired and a lot of room for improvement. If Breath of the Wild's sequel is going to feature large, prominent dungeons, the designers need to consider how to make these distinct and varied, through a core fundamental mechanic and a distinct aesthetic theme, to give the dungeon an identity. In saying all this, the Divine Beasts are fundamentally different to other Zelda dungeons because of the level of player freedom, which brings about some challenges when applying previous designs. Prior Zelda games are primarily linear, as are a large number of dungeons in the series, but Breath of the Wild is notably open and has a focus on player freedom and creativity. I do believe players still need a level of freedom to tackle different puzzles in whatever order or approach they want, as it leans into the spirit of Breath of the Wild. The fact that you can complete puzzles in an order of your choice is excellent, and with the way controlling a part of the beast's body affects the whole dungeon, they make for an interesting dungeon environment, if a bit too short and uninspired thematically. Dungeons in a game like this should continue to lean into this freedom and increase the scale and scope. We've already seen a location like this in Breath of the Wild, which provides a lot of challenge, freedom, and strong theming. Hyrule Castle. Hyrule Castle is excellent because it has a distinct atmosphere and theme, allows for player creativity, and has a sprawling scale. It features extremely tough enemies like Lynels, tunnels to get lost in, obstacles to overcome like dozens of guardians, and the ability to approach it in any way you like. This is what a good dungeon could look like in the open environment of Breath of the Wild, because it has a grand scale but is also fundamentally open-ended. For example, as soon as you enter, you can traverse the underground caves or scale the waterfall, and both will give you different obstacles and eventually lead you to Ganon. And this is just the tip of the iceberg. The only real issue comes down to the ability to skip large portions of it, which isn't inherently bad, as it depends on the player's skill and how they utilize their abilities. But since you can bypass almost the entire thing, some hindsight would probably be required in future dungeons. Still, this is a great dungeon foundation that I'd love to see explored more in Breath of the Wild sequel, with the ability to creatively overcome obstacles and face intense epic challenges, which test your mastery. With the addition of a few thematic puzzles, this could make for a great template for dungeons in an open-ended Zelda game, making dungeons an epic intense challenge, opposed to a small collection of shrine puzzles. So to recap, the 4 ways to improve dungeons in Breath of the Wild sequel are a core mechanic that sets the dungeon apart, a distinct aesthetical style that bleeds into visuals, audio, and gameplay, a larger, grander scale to bring about more feelings of excitement and anticipation, and an emphasis on freedom that lets you approach the dungeon in a variety of ways. Now, I'm not qualified or skilled enough to design a dungeon with these qualities, or rather a good dungeon, but in the hands of experts, I feel as though this direction could yield some incredible dungeons in Breath of the Wild sequel. You could have a dungeon centered around gravity, which tests you on the new ability to pass through surfaces, which we saw in one of the trailers, or a grand lightning dungeon, which requires you to alter currents of electricity to activate parts of the dungeon, like a blend of the Electric Path Shrine from Breath of the Wild with the Sandship dungeon in Skyward Sword. This, of course, is all brainstorming, and I'm sure an actual game designer could come up with more inspired ideas than me. But I'm sure you can see the exciting, creative, and varied dungeons you could make with the right technique. The Divine Beasts are a good start, but there's so much potential with what dungeons you could create in a game like Breath of the Wild. The first time I played Breath of the Wild, I felt such a sense of wonder, freedom, and excitement that I don't think will ever be replicated. But I am excited to see what the sequel will bring, and if it replicates that feeling in some capacity. I deeply adore Breath of the Wild, and I love seeing developers try new things and take risks. Of course, with new approaches comes new challenges and areas for improvement. Since Zelda has been primarily linear for so long, it makes sense that Breath of the Wild has strengths and weaknesses, being the first new step into this open-ended design philosophy. But I think there's a lot of potential for what the sequel can do with the foundations built by the first game, to improve upon the shortcomings and create another incredible experience. The designs I mentioned are only suggestions, based upon how designers might look to improve elements from the first game, be it the durability mechanic and breakable weapons, or the way dungeons are designed. But I do think these areas could help the sequel to Breath of the Wild stand apart from its predecessor, and blow everyone's expectations out of the water. Who knows? We'll have to wait and see. I'm Prime Hylian, and thanks for watching.